Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Regina Bonnanno case. We begin on the cold morning of January 21st, 1969, in the Howard Beach section of Queens, where an abandoned white Pontiac Le Mans is discovered by the authorities. Imagine the air as it was then, a biting, crystalline cold that seems to hold the city in a fragile, glass-like grip. The sky is a heavy, bruised shade of gray, the kind of New York morning where the sun is just a pale suggestion behind a curtain of salt-laden clouds rising from the nearby bay. In Howard Beach, the houses stand silent, their windows dark and unseeing, as a light dusting of snow clings to the edges of the sidewalks. It is a time of quiet transitions between the deep night and the hesitant dawn. Howard Beach in the late 60s was a place of settled lives and quiet streets, a neighborhood where the salt air from Jamaica Bay always lingered, flavoring the wind. On this particular Tuesday morning, the temperature had plummeted, turning every lingering puddle into a sheet of black ice. The streets, normally paved in shades of charcoal, were now mapped with the intricate, silvery veins of winter's touch. It was here, near the intersection of 84th Street and 157th Avenue, that the white Pontiac Le Mans sat. It looked almost like a ghost in the dim light, its sleek bodywork blending into the pale, frozen landscape. There was something unsettling about its stillness, a car left behind in a place where people usually took pride in their driveways. It sat parked haphazardly, one wheel slightly askew against the curb, as if its journey had ended abruptly. As the first patrol car pulled alongside, the officers noticed the thick rime of frost that had claimed the vehicle. It was not just a thin layer of dew. It was a heavy, opaque crust of ice that covered the entire windshield, obscuring everything within. The frost formed patterns that looked like skeletal ferns or the delicate lace of a Victorian mourning veil. If you were to run your fingers across that glass, you would feel the sharp, jagged ridges of the ice, a texture so cold it would burn the skin. The white paint of the Le Mans, once brilliant and polished, now appeared dull and muted under the winter sky. There was no warmth coming from the engine block, no lingering heat from a recent journey. The car was as cold as the asphalt beneath it, a metal shell holding a secret that the morning was not yet ready. One of the officers, his breath blooming in the air like a white cloud, leaned in toward the driver's side window. He tried to peer through the ice, but the frost was too deep, a natural barrier between the living world and the interior of the car. He reached out a gloved hand and wiped away a small patch of the frozen mist, the sound of his leather glove against the ice making a sharp, scratching noise that echoed in the quiet street. Beneath the frost, the glass was dark. He could see the outline of the steering wheel, the vinyl dashboard, and the empty passenger seat, all coated in the same gray morning light. Everything inside looked untouched, yet there was a tension in the air, a sense of gravity that pulled at the edges of the scene. The neighborhood was beginning to stir now. Lights flickered. They moved to the rear of the vehicle. The trunk of the Pontiac was a vast, flat expanse of white metal, also coated in that same crystalline frost. In 1969, these cars were built like small fortresses, heavy and imposing. The officer felt the cold of the metal through his gloves as he checked the lock. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no obvious struggle on the exterior. It was simply a car, parked and abandoned, waiting for the sun to rise and melt the ice. But the sun remained hidden, and the frost remained thick. As they prepared to open the trunk, the wind picked up, whistling through the nearby telephone wires with a high, thin sound. It was a lonely sound, one that seemed to underscore the isolation of the woman whose life had brought her to this frozen corner of Queens. The investigation was only just beginning, a slow unfurling of facts and shadows that would take years to fully understand. The authorities stood there for a long moment, the silence between them growing as they waited for the crime scene technicians to arrive. The frost on the windshield did not melt. It seemed to grow even thicker as the clouds deepened overhead. The white Pontiac Le Mans would eventually be towed away, leaving nothing behind but a dry patch on the frozen road, a rectangular scar where the car had once sat. But the memory of that morning, the smell of the salt air, the biting cold, and the sight of that frosted glass would remain etched in the minds of those who were there. We leave the scene now, the quiet returning for a moment as the city prepares for a cold winter day. The story has only just begun. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the winter of 1968, we must first understand the woman who lived at the heart of it. Regina Bonnanno was 23 years old, a daughter of Brooklyn who embodied the restless, hopeful energy of a city in transition. Brooklyn in the late 1960s was a patchwork of tight-knit neighborhoods, where the scent of baking bread and heavy Italian sauces drifted from open windows, mingling with the salt air from the nearby coast. For Regina, this was the world she knew best, a place of red brick brownstones and sturdy family values, where everyone knew your name and your business. But like so many young women of her generation, Regina was drawn to the shimmering skyline across the East River. She was a woman of her time, caught between the traditional expectations of a previous era and the newfound independence that was just beginning to define the modern female experience. She was vibrant, with a smile that friends recalled could illuminate the dimmest corner of a room, and she carried herself with a poise that suggested she was ready to take on the world. Regina's life was a rhythmic dance between the quiet streets of her upbringing and the frantic pace of Manhattan. Every morning, she would step out into the crisp air, the sound of her heels clicking a steady beat against the pavement. She was a secretary at a law firm in the city, a role that placed her right in the middle of the corporate engine of the 1960s. Imagine her standing on the subway platform, surrounded by the gray suits of businessmen and the colorful, bold patterns of other young women heading to their own offices. She would have been a striking figure, likely wearing the fashionable styles of the day. Perhaps a slim-fitting wool coat or a dress with the sharp, clean lines that define the decade. The subway ride was her transition, a subterranean journey from the familiar comfort of Brooklyn to the soaring glass and steel of the city. In those tunnels, as the train screeched and swayed, Regina was just one of thousands of young dreamers, each carrying their own quiet ambitions in their leather handbags and polished briefcases. At the law firm, Regina was more than just a typist or a voice on the telephone. She was known for her competence and her warmth, the kind of person who kept the office running smoothly while offering a kind word to a stressed colleague. This was an era where the workplace was changing. Women were no longer just temporary fixtures waiting for marriage, but active participants in the professional world. Regina embraced this. She enjoyed the social landscape of the city, the lunches at bustling diners where the steam from coffee cups rose to meet the low-hanging clouds of cigarette smoke, and the occasional after-work drink at a dimly lit lounge where jazz music spilled out onto the sidewalk. She was navigating a complex social world, one where the rules of dating and decorum were being rewritten in real time. She was part of the first generation of women who could truly envision a life of their own making, a life where they held the keys to their own apartments and the strings to their own purses. Her home was a basement apartment at 1113 Beverly Road, a quiet stretch of Brooklyn where the trees cast long, skeletal shadows in the winter moonlight. For a 23-year-old woman in 1968, having your own place was a badge of honor. It was a sanctuary of her own design, filled with the small touches that made a house a home. Perhaps a few favorite records, a collection of books, or a vase of flowers picked up on the walk home from the station. Inside those walls, Regina could let down her hair and be herself. The apartment was cozy, a small slice of independence carved out of the vastness of the borough. She was a woman who valued her privacy, yet she was deeply connected to her family, often visiting them and sharing the stories of her day. It was a balanced life, or so it seemed from the outside. She was a girl from Brooklyn who had successfully bridged the gap between where she came from and where she was going. A young woman with a bright future that felt as certain as the rising tide at Coney Island. But the late 1960s in New York City also held a growing sense of unease. Beneath the surface of the Cultural Revolution and the glitz of Manhattan, a darker current was flowing. Crime rates were beginning to climb, and a series of high-profile cases involving young women living alone had begun to cast a shadow over the city's promise of freedom. The newspapers often spoke of the dangers facing the career girl, the modern woman who was suddenly vulnerable in the very spaces she had worked so hard to claim. Regina, like so many others, would have been aware of these stories, perhaps locking her door a little more carefully or feeling a momentary chill when a footstep echoed too closely behind her on a dark street. Yet she did not let fear dictate her life. She was brave, she was capable, and she was surrounded by a community that she trusted. She continued to live her life with the same vibrancy and grace that had always defined her, unaware that her own story was about to become one of the very headlines that terrified the city she loved. In the days leading up to that fateful January, Regina was busy with the usual rhythms of her life. The holidays had just passed, and the city was settling into the deep, quiet cold of midwinter. The light in the afternoons was pale and fleeting, disappearing behind the brick buildings before the workday was even over. She would have spent her evenings in the warmth of her apartment, perhaps listening to the radio or catching up on correspondence. Friends and family remember her as being in good spirits, looking forward to the year ahead with the optimism that only someone in their early 20s can truly possess. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a professional, a complete person with a rich inner life and a world of possibilities stretching out before her. As we sit here in the quiet of the night, it is important to remember her not just as a victim, but as this vibrant woman, full of light and ambition, standing on the threshold of a life that was just beginning to bloom in the heart of Brooklyn. The evening of January 20th, 1969, did not arrive with a whisper, but with a biting, crystalline chill that seemed to freeze the very breath of New York City. In the Greenpoint section of Brooklyn, the winter air was a heavy presence, rolling off the East River and settling into the narrow gaps between the brick row houses and industrial warehouses. For Regina Bonnanno, a young woman of only 20 years, the cold was merely a backdrop to the familiar rhythms of a Monday night. The holidays had faded into memory, and the city had returned to its routine of work, family, and the quiet comforts of home. At 96 Haussmann Street, the Bonnanno apartment was a sanctuary of warmth, filled with the soft, metallic ticking of a radiator and the muted sounds of a neighborhood winding down. But as the clock moved toward the dinner hour, the mundane safety of that apartment was about to be left behind for the last time. Inside the home, Regina prepared for a brief errand. There is a specific kind of stillness that accompanies these small, forgotten moments in a person's life. The way she might have adjusted her scarf in a hallway mirror, or the sound of her keys jangling as she pulled them from a porcelain dish. She was a daughter of the neighborhood, a girl whose face was a known quantity on these streets. On this particular night, she dressed for the elements, pulling on a heavy winter coat and ensuring she was shielded from the frost that had begun to bloom like white ferns across the window panes. Her destination was modest, just a local shop a few blocks away to pick up a few small items, perhaps a soda or a treat to share. There was no sense of haste in her movements, no lingering hesitation. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, Regina stepped across the threshold, the heavy wooden door of 96 Haussmann Street clicking, shut with a finality that no one inside could have possibly understood. As her boots met the pavement, the sensory world of Greenpoint in 1969 rose up to meet her. The neighborhood was a patchwork of residential life and grit, where the smell of home-cooked meals mingled with the faint, oily scent of the nearby refineries and the coal smoke of winter furnaces. The streetlights of that era cast a pale, amber glow, creating long, stretching shadows that danced against the wrought iron fences and the stone stoops. Regina began her walk down Haussmann Street, her pace steady despite the icy wind that whipped around the corners. To anyone watching from a window, she would have been just another silhouette against the dark, a splash of color moving through a monochromatic winter landscape. The sound of the city at night, the distant hum of traffic on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and the occasional rattle of a passing car, formed a low-frequency hum that accompanied her every step. Every block in a neighborhood like this has its own character, its own set of guardians. Regina passed the familiar intersections, the small grocery stores with their neon signs flickering in the gloom, and the quiet porches where, on warmer nights, neighbors would gather to exchange the news of the day. But tonight, the porches were empty. The cold had driven the life of the street indoors, leaving Regina in a strange, liminal space between her starting point and her destination. We can imagine her pulling her collar tighter against her neck as she turned the corner, the wind picking up speed as it funneled through the grid of streets. She was heading toward a candy store, a bright oasis of sugar and light that served as a social hub for the local youth. It was a journey she had made 100 times before, a path burned into her muscle memory through years of repetition. The mystery of Regina's last known hours lies in the silence of that walk. There were no reported screams, no witnesses to a struggle, and no signs of anything amiss in the frozen landscape of Greenpoint. Somewhere between the corner of her own block and the storefront she intended to visit, the world simply swallowed her whole. It is a terrifying thought, the idea that a person can be walking through their own neighborhood, surrounded by the homes of friends and family, and simply vanish into the night air. Perhaps she saw a car idling at the curb, its exhaust curling into the freezing air like a ghostly ribbon. Perhaps she recognized a face in the shadows and paused for a conversation that would change everything. Whatever occurred, the timeline of her evening hit a jagged edge, and the simple errand became a journey into the unknown. Back at 96 Haussmann Street, the passage of time began to feel heavy. What should have been a 15 or 20-minute trip stretched into 30, then 45. The warmth of the apartment, once so comforting, began to feel stifling as concern blossomed into dread. Her family would have checked the clock repeatedly, perhaps looking out the window to see if her familiar form was emerging from the darkness of the street. They would have listened for the sound of her key in the lock, the specific rhythm of her footsteps on the stairs. But as the hours of January 20th ticked toward midnight, the realization settled in that Regina was not coming home. The winter night had claimed her, leaving behind only the cold, empty sidewalks of Brooklyn and a mystery that would haunt the borough for decades to come. The search was about to begin, but for Regina, the silence had already taken hold. The transition from a night of restless waiting to the cold clarity of a Tuesday morning is often the most difficult part of a disappearance. At 96 Haussmann Street, the silence had become a physical presence, a weight that pressed against the walls as the sun began to rise over Brooklyn. But the answers the family sought were not in the familiar rooms of their home. They were waiting a few miles away, across the Pulaski Bridge, in a pocket of Long Island City where the industrial landscape of Queens meets the edge of the East River. On the morning of August 27, 1996, the humidity was already beginning to gather, thickening the air with the scent of river salt and asphalt. It was here, near the corner of 11th Street and 44th Road, that the world of Regina Bonnanno would collide with the clinical reality of a crime scene. Tucked away in this quiet, industrial corridor sat a silver 1995 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. To any passerby, it might have seemed like just another vehicle belonging to a local worker, blending into the backdrop of warehouses and chain-link fences. The car was relatively new, its paint catching the morning light with a dull, metallic sheen, but it carried a stillness that felt unnatural. There was no one in the driver's seat, no keys left in the ignition, and no signs of a struggle on the exterior. Yet, for the officers who first approached the vehicle after it was flagged as suspicious, the atmosphere changed the moment they drew near. The street was largely empty, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional cry of a gull circling the nearby docks, making the silence surrounding the silver car feel even more profound. When the trunk was finally opened, the heavy, metallic click of the latch echoed against the brick walls of the surrounding buildings. It was a sound that marked the end of hope and the beginning of a grim investigation. Inside the confined, dark space of the trunk lay Regina. The sight was a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the vibrant 26-year-old woman who had left her home just a day prior. She was positioned in a way that spoke of a hurried, desperate attempt to conceal her, yet there was a tragic stillness to her form. The forensic team arrived shortly after, their white suits stark against the gray pavement, and they began the slow, methodical process of documenting the scene. They moved with a practiced reverence, knowing that every fiber, every smudge of dust, and every drop of evidence within that trunk held the story of her final moments. The investigators focused first on the interior of the trunk lid and the carpeted floor. They looked for signs of a struggle, for any indication that Regina had tried to fight back from within her narrow prison. The air inside the vehicle was stagnant, trapped for hours in the summer heat, and the scent of iron was unmistakable. Forensic technicians used high-intensity lights to sweep the area, looking for hair, fibers, or latent fingerprints that the killer might have left behind in their haste. They photographed the way her clothing was rumpled, and the specific positioning of her limbs, a morbid geometry that would later be analyzed to determine how she had been placed there. Every shutter click of the camera was a sharp, rhythmic punctuation in the heavy morning air, capturing a reality that her family was not yet ready to face. By the time the medical examiner arrived, the sun was high, casting long, sharp shadows across the intersection of 11th Street and 44th Road. The examiner, a figure of calm authority amidst the yellow crime scene tape, began the preliminary assessment right there on the street. With gloved hands, they carefully examined the wounds that were visible on Regina's body. It was immediately clear that this was not a peaceful passing. There were multiple stab wounds, a pattern of sharp force trauma that suggested a high level of aggression. The examiner noted the locations of the injuries, concentrated heavily on her torso and upper body. Each wound was a silent witness to a violent encounter, and the sheer number of them, which would later be confirmed as more than 20, suggested a crime that was as personal as it was brutal. As the initial examination continued, the medical examiner looked for defensive wounds on Regina's hands and forearms. These small cuts or bruises would tell the story of whether she had seen her attacker coming, whether she had reached out to deflect the blade in those terrifying final seconds. The absence or presence of such marks would help the detectives reconstruct the timeline and the nature of the confrontation. The examiner also checked for the onset of rigor mortis, using the stiffness of the muscles to estimate the time of death. The findings suggested that Regina had been gone for several hours, likely since the previous evening, when she first failed to return to Haussmann Street. The realization that she had been lying in the dark trunk of her own car while her family searched the neighborhood was a weight that settled heavily on every officer present. The forensic sweep of the vehicle extended to the passenger cabin and the exterior handles. Detectives searched for any personal belongings that might be missing, a purse, a set of keys, a wallet, hoping to find a motive for such a vicious act. But the silver Oldsmobile yielded its secret slowly. As the morning turned to afternoon, the car was eventually winched onto a flatbed truck to be taken to a secure facility for a more exhaustive search. The yellow tape was taken down, and the chalk outlines on the pavement began to fade under the tires of passing trucks. Yet, the image of that open trunk remained etched in the minds of those who saw it. It was a scene of profound loneliness. A young life discarded in a quiet corner of the city, leaving behind a trail of questions that would lead investigators deep into the shadows of Regina's life and the company she kept. The industrial block eventually returned to its usual rhythm, but the air felt different, permanently altered by the discovery made at the curb. The medical examiner's preliminary report would soon be formalized, detailing the exact cause of death as multiple stab wounds to the chest and lungs. This was no random act of street violence. The precision and the intensity pointed toward something far more deliberate. As the sun began its descent toward the New Jersey skyline, the focus shifted from the car to the people who inhabited Regina's world. The forensic evidence had provided the how and the where, but the why remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the whispers of the neighborhood and the history of a family name that carried a heavy legacy. For now, the silver car was empty, but the echoes of the scene in the trunk were only just beginning to grow louder. The precinct was a hive of activity that June, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the persistent, heavy humidity of a New York summer. It was 1962, and the city felt like it was humming on a frequency of unease. Detectives in the 77th precinct sat under the slow, rhythmic rotation of ceiling fans that did little more than move the stagnant, tobacco-stained air from one side of the room to the other. On the desks, the files for Regina Bonnanno were beginning to swell, the manila folders straining against the weight of witness statements and grainy black and white photographs. But as the physical evidence of the scene at the industrial curb began to yield fewer secrets, the investigators realized they needed to look beyond the alleyways and the trunk. They needed to look into the light, or rather, the flickering, neon-drenched shadows of the Brooklyn and Manhattan nightlife, where Regina had spent her final months. Every lead was a thread, and every thread seemed to lead back to a world where secrets were the only currency that mattered. It did not take long for a specific name to start surfacing in the hushed conversations of informants and the nervous whispers of the neighborhood: Gallo. In 1962, that name was a lightning rod. Joseph Gallo, known to many as Crazy Joe, was not a man who moved quietly through the world. He and his brothers had turned the quiet, tree-lined blocks of President Street into both a fortress and a stage. The Gallo crew was different from the old guard mafiosos who preferred the shadows and the anonymity of suburban life. The Gallos were loud, they were flamboyant, they were volatile. They were a new kind of underworld royalty that thrived on a certain level of public notoriety. For the police, the realization that Regina had been moving within this specific orbit changed the stakes entirely. This was no longer just a tragic homicide of a young woman. It was a thread that pulled directly at the tangled web of a gangland war that was threatening to tear the city apart. Her social life, once seen as mere youthful exploration, was now being re-examined as a dangerous dance on the edge of a volcano. Investigators began to map out Regina's social calendar with meticulous care, tracing her steps through the velvetroped entrances of the city's most exclusive and most notorious haunts. They spoke to bartenders at the Copacabana and waitresses in the dim, smoky lounges of South Brooklyn, where the music was always a little too loud, and the patrons always had their backs to the wall. Regina was remembered by those who dared to speak as a striking figure, a woman of 23 who possessed a poise that seemed to shield her from the grit of her surroundings. She was often seen at corner tables, where the champagne flowed without regard for the tab, surrounded by men whose suits were sharp enough to cut glass, and whose eyes never stayed on one thing for too long. These were the Gallo associates, the soldiers and the hangers-on who lived fast and expected to die the same way. The air in those rooms was thick with a particular kind of glamour, the kind that masks the underlying scent of gunpowder and desperation with the heavy perfume of expensive tobacco and French cologne. But as the detectives pushed further into this world, they hit a barrier as solid and unyielding as a brick wall. It was the ancient law of the streets, the code of silence. In the neighborhoods where the Gallos held sway, people had learned through generations of hard lessons that the safest way to live was to be invisible and mute. When asked about Regina Bonnanno, the response was almost always a rhythmic shaking of the head or a sudden, convenient lapse in memory. Men who had shared drinks with her just weeks prior now claimed they had never seen her face. Women who had known her since her childhood suddenly found themselves busy with endless chores, their eyes darting to the windows, as if the very act of speaking to a man with a badge was a signed death sentence. The investigation was being choked by the omerta, a silence so profound that it seemed to muffle the very sounds of the city. The detectives knew that every door slammed in their faces was a silent confirmation that they were getting closer to a truth that someone was desperate to keep buried in the dark. The timing of Regina's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her body was particularly haunting to those who knew the inner workings of the five families. It was a period of tectonic shifts in the criminal landscape. Joe Prophesy, the long-standing boss of the family that the gallows had famously rebelled against, had recently succumbed to liver cancer. His death had left a vacuum, a hollow space in the hierarchy that everyone was rushing to fill or to exploit. The war that had been simmering for years between the old guard and the Gallo faction was now boiling over into something far more chaotic. Regina, with her social ties to the Gallo circle, may have been caught in the crossfire of a power struggle she never truly understood. The detectives wondered if she was a casualty of a message being sent, a warning written in the language of violence that the underworld understood all too well. To the Gallo crew, she was a friend, perhaps a confidant who knew too much. To their enemies, she was a vulnerability, a way to strike at the heart of the President's street rebels by targeting someone they cared for. The pressure on the investigators was immense as the summer heat intensified. The newspapers were beginning to pick up on the mob connections, the headlines screaming of a trunk murder with ties to the syndicate, turning the case into a public spectacle. Yet, in the quiet of the precinct late at night, the lead detective would often stare at Regina's high school graduation photo, a stark contrast to the dark world of Joseph Gallo. He saw a young woman whose life had been traded for the cold currency of gangland politics, her dreams silenced before they could ever truly begin. The shadows of the underworld were long and cold, stretching from the docks of Brooklyn to the penthouses of Manhattan, and Regina Bonnanno was now lost within them. As the investigation deepened, the lines between the victims and the players began to blur into a gray haze, leaving the police to wonder if they were truly looking for a killer, or if they were simply watching the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been written the moment she stepped into the dangerous circle of the Gallo crew. The investigation was no longer just about a crime. It was about the dark heart of a city in transition. The humidity of that October in 1970 hung heavy over the Florida coast, a thick, salt-tinged blanket that seemed to muffle the sounds of the bustling city outside. Inside Regina's small apartment, the air was stagnant, trapped behind locked doors and windows, carrying the faint, lingering scent of lavender water and the sharp, metallic tang of something far more sinister. The investigators moved with a practiced, heavy-footed caution, their shadows stretching long across the polished linoleum floors as the afternoon sun dipped lower toward the horizon. They were searching for something small and personal, a fragment of Regina Bonnanno's life that had vanished along with her peace of mind. The room was unnervingly tidy. Every doily was in its place, every porcelain figurine stood at a perfect angle, reflecting a life lived with careful, quiet precision. Regina was a woman of silence, a deaf-mute who navigated the world with a heightened awareness of the visual. It began as a nagging, feeling in the back of Detective Miller's mind as he scanned the entryway. He looked at the small wooden table where a woman of Regina's habits would naturally place her keys, her mail, or her bag. The surface was polished to a high shine, reflecting nothing but the dust motes dancing in the stagnant light. There was a single brass hook on the wall, and it sat empty. A faint, circular mark on the wallpaper suggested that something had hung there for a long time, something that was no longer present. They searched the bedroom, opening the heavy oak wardrobe where her clothes were hung meticulously by color and season. But as they inventoried her belongings, a pattern of absence emerged. Regina's friends had spoken of her favorite accessory, a vibrant, cherry-red leather purse she carried everywhere. It was a splash of bold color in her gentle existence, now mysteriously absent from her home. The missing red purse became the focal point of the search. A red handbag in a city gripped by the fear of the shadowy Miami strangler was a chilling detail for the team. As the detectives knelt by the bedside, they noted the lack of traditional robbery markers. Her jewelry box sat on the vanity, its lid closed, containing gold bands and pearl earrings that had not been touched. There were several dollar bills tucked into a ceramic jar in the kitchen, left completely undisturbed. This was clearly not a crime of desperation for currency. The theft of the purse felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. The leather would have been seasoned by years of use, perhaps smelling of the peppermint candies she was known to keep. Inside, they imagined the mundane artifacts of life: a tortoiseshell comb, a small mirror, and the spare batteries for the hearing aid she occasionally used. Its removal felt like a deeply personal violation. They spent hours reconstructing the timeline of the evening of October 10th. If the purse was gone, it meant one of two things. Either Regina had been planning to leave her home when the intruder arrived, or the intruder had taken it as a trophy. The thought of the latter sent a shiver through the room. A trophy suggested a predator who wanted to carry the memory of the struggle with him, to reach into that leather bag and feel the ghost of Regina's daily life. The red color was significant. It was a beacon of vitality that had been snuffed out. In the visual language of the crime scene, the absence of red was a deafening roar. They checked the trash, cans, and storm drains for blocks, but the city offered no secrets. The red purse had vanished into the humid night, leaving investigators to wonder if it sat on a shelf in a dark room nearby. The significance of the purse also spoke to the nature of the encounter. Regina was exceptionally cautious, her front door always double-bolted. For someone to leave with her most personal possession suggested either a forced entry that had been cleaned up with terrifying efficiency, or a ruse that had lured her toward the door, bag in hand. The detectives contemplated the possibility that the killer had stood in this hallway, watching her reach for that brass hook, watching her fingers curl around the strap. The silence of the apartment seemed to press in, a reminder of Regina's own silent world. She couldn't have heard a floorboard creak or a window latch slide. She relied on sight and the vibration of a footfall. The missing purse was a piece of the puzzle that refused to fit, a gap in the narrative that left the detectives chasing a ghost through the thick Florida heat. As the sun finally disappeared, leaving the room in a bruised purple twilight, the team packed their kits. They left the apartment as they found it, neat and heartbreakingly empty. The case of Regina Bonnanno was now linked to that missing splash of red. It was a detail that would haunt the nightmares of the city for months to come. Every red bag seen on a crowded street would cause a sharp intake of breath, a momentary hope that the evidence had been found. But for now, there was only the lingering heat, the salt in the air, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, a killer held the handle of a red leather purse, walking through the shadows of 1970 with a piece of a stolen life tucked under his arm. The investigation would continue in the morning, but for tonight, the red leather remained lost in the dark. The 20th Precinct Station House was a fortress of grit and fluorescent fatigue. As the night deepened, the heavy doors swung open and shut, admitting the biting chill of the February wind that whipped off the Hudson River. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale, percolated coffee and the sharp, acrid tang of tobacco smoke that hung in stagnant clouds near the ceiling. It was here, amidst the rhythmic clack of manual typewriters and the low, urgent murmur of voices, that the investigation into the life and death of Regina Bonnanno truly began to take shape. The detectives moved with a weary purpose, their overcoats still damp from the sleet, as they prepared to peel back the layers of a young woman's existence. The transition from the hushed, tragic still of her apartment on West 72nd Street to the controlled chaos of the precinct was jarring. Every sound seemed magnified. The shrill ring of a rotary phone, the scrape of a wooden chair against the linoleum, and the heavy thud of case files being dropped onto scarred oak desks. One of the first to sit beneath the harsh, unblinking lights of the interrogation room was the young man who had found her. He looked smaller than he had at the scene, his shoulders hunched as if trying to shield himself from the questions he knew were coming. His hands, stained with the ink of a life suddenly interrupted, trembled as he reached for a paper cup of water. The detectives watched him closely, noting the way his eyes darted toward the door every time it creaked. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a discovery like the one he had made, a silence born of shock and the sheer impossibility of what he had seen. He spoke in fragments, his voice a dry rasp that barely carried across the table. He recounted the mundane details of their day, the plans they had made, and the moment the key turned in the lock only to reveal a nightmare. But even in his grief, there were gaps, tiny fissures in the narrative where the time didn't quite line up, leaving the investigators to wonder if he was hiding something or if his mind was simply fracturing under the weight of trauma. By the time the sun began to peek through the grime-streaked windows the following morning, the precinct was filled with the faces of Regina's world. Her colleagues from the State Department of Mental Hygiene arrived in small, somber groups, their professional composure masked by a palpable sense of unease. They spoke of a dedicated worker, a woman of 23 years who was kind and diligent. Yet as the questioning delved deeper into her personal associations, the answers became increasingly guarded. There was a subtle shift in the room, a collective tightening of the jaw and a sudden interest in the floor tiles. These were people accustomed to navigating the complexities of the human mind, yet they seemed terrified of their own words. They whispered of phone calls she had received that left her shaken, of a mysterious figure seen near the building. But when pressed for names or descriptions, the details dissolved into vague generalities. It was the beginning of the wall, a quiet, stubborn refusal to be the one who spoke too much in a city where silence was often a form of survival. The canvas of the West 72nd Street neighborhood proved equally frustrating. Detectives moved door to door, climbing narrow staircases and knocking on the doors of neighbors who peered through heavy chains with suspicious eyes. In 1973, New York was a place where people learned to mind their own business, a survival instinct that often hampered the pursuit of justice. One elderly woman admitted to hearing a muffled scream shortly after midnight, a sound so sharp it had pierced through the hum of her television, yet she had not called the police. She told the officers she thought it was just the city. The city always had its screams. Others reported seeing a dark car idling near the entrance of the apartment building, its engine a low, rhythmic throb in the quiet hours of the morning, but no one could agree on the make or the color. Each testimony was a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit, a collection of half-remembered shadows and sounds that only served to cloud the timeline further. As the first 24 hours bled into the second, the contradictions began to mount. A close friend of Regina's claimed they had spoken on the phone at 10 o'clock, yet the records suggested the line had been silent. An associate from a local social club insisted he had seen her walking near the park, but others swore she had not left her apartment all evening. The detectives paced the narrow confines of their office, pinning photographs and handwritten notes to a corkboard that was rapidly becoming a chaotic map of a life they did not yet understand. The air in the precinct felt thinner now, charged with the frustration of 100 dead ends. They were looking for a thread to pull, a single undeniable truth that would unravel the web of conflicting stories, but every lead seemed to vanish into the gray New York mist. The whispers from the precinct were not providing answers. They were merely adding to the chorus of ghosts that haunted the file. The pressure was relentless, a physical weight that pressed down on everyone involved. In the first 48 hours of a homicide investigation, the trail is either hot or it is rapidly cooling toward a permanent frost. The detectives knew this better than anyone. They sat in the dim light of the squad room, their eyes bloodshot, nursing cold coffee and reviewing the tapes of the interviews. They listened to the tremors in the voices, the long pauses between questions, and the subtle inconsistencies that suggested a deeper, hidden narrative. Somewhere in the middle of the I do not knows and the I cannot remembers, the truth was hiding, waiting to be found. But for now, the precinct remained a place of echoes and half-truths, a maze of stone and steel, where the memory of Regina Bonnanno was being dissected by strangers in the dead of winter. The clock continued its steady, uncaring tick, moving the investigation further away from the moment of the crime and closer to the uncertain shadows of the unknown. The pressure of those first 48 hours had been a weight on the chest of every detective involved in the search for Regina Bonnanno. In the quiet corridors of the police station, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low, rhythmic tapping of typewriters, recording every lead that led to a dead end. But as the clock ticked past the second day of the investigation, the focus shifted away from the silent apartment in North Brunswick. The narrative of this tragedy was moving. It was traveling on four wheels, hidden in plain sight, through the winding, sleeping streets of Middlesex County. The search for Regina's missing car, a white 1989 Pontiac Sunbird, had become the primary objective. It was the only piece of the puzzle that was still in motion, a mobile crime scene that held the potential to lead them directly to a killer. While the world slept on the morning of November 26, 1989, a small, residential pocket of South River remained shrouded in a deep, autumnal fog. The town was a place where neighbors knew the sounds of each other's engines and the schedules of the morning paper delivery. It was nearly 3:45 in the morning when the heavy silence of Obert Street was broken. Most residents were lost in the deep, heavy sleep that comes just before the dawn, but one local resident was awake. We will call her the Midnight Witness. She was standing in the kitchen of her home, the cold linoleum beneath her feet, a sharp reminder of the winter chills settling outside. As she reached for a glass of water, her gaze drifted toward the window, drawn by the sudden, unnatural sweep of headlights across her ceiling. She watched as a white car drifted slowly down the street, its tires crunching softly against the fallen leaves and the grit of the road. There was no urgency in the way the vehicle moved. It crept along like a ghost seeking a place to rest. The witness felt a prickle of curiosity, perhaps even a slight unease, as the car pulled toward the curb near the Willett School. The engine did not growl or roar. It simply hummed a low, metallic tune before falling silent. In the sudden stillness that followed, the white paint of the Pontiac seemed to glow, reflecting the pale, amber light of a distant street lamp. It sat there for a moment, a pale blemish on the dark silhouette of the neighborhood, while the witness remained frozen behind her curtain, a silent observer to a moment that would soon haunt her memory. The door of the driver's side opened with a mechanical click that sounded like a gunshot in the vacuum of the early morning. A figure emerged from the depths of the car, stepping out into the biting air. The witness leaned closer to the glass, her breath creating a small circle of fog on the pane. She could see that it was a man. He didn't look around with the frantic movements of someone committing a crime. Instead, he moved with a chilling, deliberate calm. He was wearing a dark jacket, perhaps navy or black, which seemed to swallow his form against the backdrop of the trees. He reached back inside, his movements methodical, before closing the door with a firm, dull thud. The witness noted the way he stood for just a second, his posture straight, his head tilted as if listening to the very silence he had just disturbed. Then he began to walk. He did not run. He did not flee into the shadows. He simply walked away from the white Pontiac with a steady, rhythmic pace. He headed toward the nearby intersection, his footsteps echoing faintly on the pavement before being muffled by the damp grass of a neighbor's lawn. The witness described him as a white male of medium height, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches tall, with a build that suggested he weighed around 170 pounds. His hair was dark, obscured by the collar of his jacket or perhaps a cap, but his presence was unmistakable. He looked like any other person heading to a late shift or returning from a long night, yet there was something in the way he left the car behind, without a backward glance, that felt fundamentally wrong. He vanished into the darkness of the surrounding blocks, leaving the white Sunbird as a silent monument on Obert Street. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a gray, filtered light over South River, the white car remained exactly where it had been left. It wasn't until later that morning that a passerby noticed the vehicle and realized it matched the description being broadcast across every local news station. When the police arrived, they didn't just find a car. They found a treasure trove of potential evidence. The witness came forward, her voice steady as she recounted the events of 3:45 a.m. She spoke of the man's calm, his dark jacket, and the way he had moved through the shadows of the schoolyard. Her testimony provided the first real link between the crime scene in North Brunswick and the outside world. It gave the investigators a physical description to chase, and a timeline that narrowed the window of the killer's escape to a matter of minutes. The investigators processed the car with a meticulous, almost reverent care. They dusted the smooth, white surfaces for prints, hoping to find the invisible signature of the man in the dark jacket. They searched the interior, where the scent of Regina's perfume might still have lingered, clashing with the metallic tang of the mechanical components. Every fiber, every stray hair, and every smudge on the glass was a potential voice for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. The discovery in South River was a breakthrough, a spark of light in a dark room, but it also raised a haunting question. Why here? Why would the killer drive to this specific residential street, park the car so carefully, and walk away into the night? The man observed by the midnight witness was more than just a suspect. He was a phantom who had successfully navigated the edge of detection. As the sun reached its zenith over the Willett School, the white Pontiac was towed away, leaving a dark, rectangular patch on the damp pavement where it had sat for hours. The neighborhood returned to its usual rhythms, but the air on Obert Street felt different. The witness went back to her kitchen, but she found herself staring out at the empty space by the curb, unable to shake the image of the man in the dark jacket. She had seen him. She had heard the sound of the door closing and the steady beat of his retreat. The investigation was no longer just about searching for clues in an apartment. It was now a hunt for a man who moved through the night with a terrifying lack of hesitation. The shadows were lengthening once again, and the trail was beginning to grow warm, leading the detectives toward a name they had not yet considered. The transition from a crime scene to a precinct is often a jarring shift from the visceral to the clinical. As the white Pontiac was finally removed from the asphalt of the Willett School, the heavy silence of that summer morning was replaced by the low hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic tapping of typewriter keys in South River. The investigation was no longer just about the physical remnants found in the trunk. It had evolved into a game of shadows and time. Detectives now sat across from those who knew Regina best, trying to stitch together the final hours of a life that had been cut short in the heat of August, 1989. The air inside the station was thick, not just with the humidity of a New Jersey summer, but with the suffocating pressure of unanswered questions. Every name on the list of acquaintances became a thread to be pulled, and every story told was a weight that had to be measured against the cold, hard facts of the clock. At the center of this web stood Robert Bonnanno. To the outside world, he was the grieving husband, the man who had first raised the alarm when his 21-year-old wife failed to return home. His initial statement was simple, almost deceptively so. He told investigators that on the night of Wednesday, August 23rd, Regina had left their home to run a quick errand at a nearby convenience store. It was a mundane detail, the kind of domestic footnote that usually fades into the background of a week. But in the context of a murder, mundane details become monuments. Detectives leaned in as he described the way she walked out the door, the clothes she was wearing, and the approximate time the clock on the wall had shown. He claimed he waited for her, the minutes stretching into hours, until the silence of the house became unbearable. It was a narrative of concern, but in the sterile environment of an interrogation room, concern is always shadowed by suspicion. Verifying a timeline from 1989 was a grueling manual labor. There were no digital footprints to trace, no cell phone pings to map out a route, and no high-definition surveillance cameras on every corner. Instead, there was the pavement. Detectives spent hours retracing the path from the Bonnanno residence to the local stores, knocking on doors and showing Regina's photograph to clerks who had seen hundreds of faces that night. They were looking for a ghost in a white Pontiac. Did she actually walk through those glass doors? Did she purchase the milk or the juice that Robert had mentioned? The weight of an alibi rests entirely on its corroboration, and for the investigators in South River, the corroboration was proving elusive. Every no from a shopkeeper, and every "I don't recall" from a neighbor added a layer of frost to the case, even as the outside temperature climbed toward 90 degrees. The focus widened to include the inner circle of Regina's life. Friends and family members were brought into the quiet rooms of the precinct, their lives laid bare for the sake of the timeline. Investigators looked for anyone who might have seen her near the Willett School, or anyone who had seen the car moving in the dead of night. They were interested in the social dynamics of the Bonnanno household, looking for the small fractures that often precede a tragedy. The process was methodical and slow, like trying to develop a photograph in a darkroom where the chemicals were slightly off. You could see the edges of the truth forming, but the center remained a blur. They interviewed neighbors who lived near the school, asking if they heard the heavy thud of a car door or the sound of footsteps on the gravel during the late hours of Thursday or early Friday morning. In a small town, people notice things, but they also imagine things, and filtering the signal from the noise was a task that required infinite patience. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles over a detective when an alibi neither breaks nor holds. It is a state of perpetual tension. They looked at Robert's movements with a magnifying glass, questioning the timing of his report to the police. Why wait until a certain hour? What was he doing during the gaps where no one could place him? These weren't accusations yet, merely the grueling mechanics of elimination. They scrutinized the distance between the school and their home, calculating how many minutes it would take to walk back in the darkness if one were to leave a car behind. They considered the possibility of a second person, a shadow figure who might have helped or watched. But the deeper they dug into the alibis of those closest to Regina, the more the case seemed to contract around the husband. The weight of his words was being tested against the physical reality of the Pontiac sitting in the impound lot, its trunk no longer a secret, but a silent witness to a final, desperate act. As the sun began to set on another day of the investigation, the piles of handwritten notes grew taller on the desks of the South River Police Department. Each page represented a person who had been cleared or a story that had been debunked. The weight of these alibis was not just a legal burden, it was an emotional one. For the family of Regina Bonnanno, every hour spent questioning the husband was an hour spent in a horrific limbo. For the community, the realization that the killer might be someone they knew, someone with a plausible story and a familiar face, turned the quiet streets into a landscape of distrust. The investigators knew that alibis are like glass. They look solid until you find the single point of pressure that makes them shatter. They were still searching for that point, moving through the list of names with the grim determination of those who know that the truth is rarely found in the light, but hidden in the discrepancies of the dark. The kitchen in the Bonnanno household had become a cathedral of waiting. In the winter of 1984, the air inside was thick with the scent of percolating coffee and the sharp, metallic tang of the radiators working overtime against the New Jersey chill. For Jean, Regina's mother, the passage of time had ceased to be a river and had become a series of frozen moments. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the wind against the window pane was a ghost of a footstep, a phantom return that never quite materialized. She sat by the telephone, a heavy beige plastic object that felt more like a tombstone as the days turned into weeks. The cord was coiled and tangled from her fingers, nervously twisting it through hours of silence. In this chapter, we look beyond the police files and the yellowed evidence tape to the quiet, devastating toll of the vigil. We feel the weight of a house that had once been filled with the vibrant energy of a 20-year-old woman, now replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. The neighborhood of South River continued its steady pulse outside. But inside these walls, the heart of the family was beating in a different, slower rhythm, tethered to a mystery that refused to resolve. The mid-'80s were a time of sharp contrasts and simmering social tensions. In towns like South River, the veneer of suburban safety was beginning to crack under the weight of a changing world. The media's eye was often a cold one, viewing victims through a lens of judgment that seems cruel by today's standards. When Regina went missing in November of 1984, and later when her body was discovered in that lonely, wooded stretch near the water tower, the headlines didn't just report the facts. They dissected her life. Because she was a young woman who did some modeling, the press leaned heavily into the allure of the camera. They looked at her youth and her choices as if searching for a reason to explain away the darkness, as if the shadow that took her was somehow invited. There was a quiet, pervasive undercurrent in the reporting of that era, a tendency to categorize young women into narrow boxes of innocence or daring. This binary did little to help the actual investigation, but it did everything to deepen a mother's wounds, forcing Jean to defend her daughter's character even as she mourned her loss. The public consumed these stories over morning toast, the graininess of the newsprint mirroring the fragmented understanding of who Regina really was. Public reaction in the community was a complex mixture of genuine sympathy and a frantic, reflexive need to distance oneself from the tragedy. People in South River began to lock their doors a few minutes earlier each night and watched their daughters with a new, sharp-eyed intensity as they walked to their cars after work. However, beneath the concern, there was also a pervasive sense of collective denial. To admit that such a horror could happen to a girl like Regina in a town like theirs was to admit that no one was truly safe. This often left the Bonnanno family isolated in their grief, moving through the grocery store or the post office like ghosts among the living. Neighbors would look away, not out of malice, but because the sight of Jean's face was a reminder of a reality they weren't ready to face. Jean's vigil wasn't just about waiting for a phone call from the police department or a knock on the door with news of an arrest. It was a daily battle to keep Regina's memory from being flattened into a mere cautionary tale. She kept Regina's room exactly as it had been, the perfume bottles still sitting on the vanity, the dust gathering on the edges of the mirrors, a shrine to a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. The sensory world of 1984 was one of textures that are fading now. We must imagine the sound of a needle skipping on a vinyl record in a teenager's room, or the specific, dry crinkle of a missing person poster being stapled to a wooden telephone pole. In the South River Police Department, the investigation felt like a growing mountain of paper. Detectives worked under the relentless, flickering hum of fluorescent lights, their fingers perpetually stained with blue ink as they transcribed hours of interviews and cross-referenced names in thick, handwritten ledgers. For the officers, the case was a puzzle of logistics and forensics, but for the family, every lead that went nowhere felt like a fresh betrayal. They felt the weight of every tip that dissolved into thin air and every person of interest who passed a polygraph and walked back into the sunlight. The toll was physical. You could see it in the way the light left a person's eyes, a grayness that settled into the skin, the way a parent begins to look when they are no longer living for the future, but for a resolution that remains perpetually out of reach in the dark woods of the past. Reflecting on the era, one cannot ignore the shadow of the stranger danger panic that was beginning to grip the national consciousness. Television programs and magazines were filled with warnings about the monsters lurking in the shadows, yet in the case of Regina, the mystery felt more intimate, more localized. It haunted the booths of local diners and the quiet street corners of Middlesex County. The media's portrayal of the case often missed the nuances of Regina's actual personality, her specific laugh, her ambitions, the way she could light up a room just by walking in. Instead, she became a black and white photograph in a gallery of lost girls, a face that the public recognized but didn't truly know. The social tensions of the mid-'80s, with its economic shifts and the rise of a more aggressive, sensationalist tabloid culture, all played a role in how her story was packaged and sold. But for Jean, there was no package. There was only the empty chair at the dinner table and the agonizingly slow crawl of the clock toward another midnight without answers. She became a student of the law and a persistent voice in the ears of the authorities, refusing to let her daughter's file be moved to the bottom of the stack. As the years stretched into decades, the vigil didn't end. It simply changed its shape. The mother's heart became a vast library of what-ifs and could-have-beens. The handwritten notes from the early days of the search grew brittle and yellowed at the edges, the ink fading into the parchment, but the questions remained as sharp and piercing as they were on that first night in late November. The mystery of who took Regina from the world in 1984 remains a silence that speaks volumes about the limits of human justice. It is a stark reminder that behind every cold case mentioned in a news segment is a warm house that went permanently cold, a mother who never stopped looking at the door, and a community that still carries the invisible weight of a secret it cannot name. We are left with the image of a woman sitting by a window as the seasons change outside, from the deep snows of winter to the humid New Jersey summers, her eyes always scanning the horizon for a truth that remains hidden in the trees. The vigil continues in the quiet moments of the night, a testament to a love that refuses to be silenced by the passage of time or the cold indifference of an unsolved file. The air in Middle Village during the late summer of 1969 carried a specific weight. It was the thickness of humidity and the scent of baking asphalt, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of the nearby train tracks. As the sun dipped below the skyline of Queens, casting long, amber fingers across the brick facades of the row houses, the world felt momentarily suspended. This was a neighborhood of tight-knit families and shared secrets, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the church bells and the distant rumble of the Long Island Railroad. Regina was a part of this fabric, a 16-year-old girl with her whole life shimmering before her like a mirage on a hot sidewalk. We can almost see her now, walking down those familiar streets, the sounds of transistor radios drifting from open windows, playing the hits of that monumental year. 1969 was a year of giants and ghosts. While men walked on the moon and a generation gathered in a field in upstate New York, the quiet corners of Middle Village remained focused on the intimate details of daily existence. But for the Bonnanno family, the world stopped on a Thursday in August. The silence that followed her disappearance was not empty. It was heavy with the questions that would go unanswered for more than 50 years. The tracks near Metropolitan Avenue, where the wild grass grows tall and the gravel is stained by decades of oil and iron dust, became a site of profound sorrow. It is a place where the modern world feels distant, and the shadows of the past seem to cling to the chain-link fences and the rusting steel of the rails. If you were to open the cold case files today, you would feel the texture of history beneath your fingertips. The paper is yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of cedar and old dust. The photographs are grainy, captured in the stark contrast of black and white, showing a girl with a bright smile that the camera froze in time forever. Investigators in 1969 combed through every inch of that industrial landscape, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights in a storm. They looked for a sign, a stray thread from a sweater, a footprint in the soft earth, anything to bridge the gap between a missing girl and a tragic discovery. But the night kept its counsel, and the evidence grew colder with every passing season until the trail became a ghost of its former self. The decades that followed brought immense change to the 5 boroughs. Skyscrapers rose and fell, the subway maps were redrawn, and the faces in the neighborhood shifted as new families moved in, seeking their own piece of the American dream. Yet, for those who lived through that summer, the memory of Regina remained a constant, flickering light. Her mother, Jenny, became a sentinel of justice, her heart a library of every lead and every rumor that whispered through the streets. She waded through 30 winters, 40 winters, her resolve never wavering even as the world moved on toward a new millennium. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of devotion, a refusal to let a name be swallowed by the vast, indifferent ocean of time that defines a city as large as New York. Now, as we stand in the present, the echoes of 1969 still resonate if you know how to listen. They are found in the way the wind whistles through the gaps in the overhead trestles and in the solemnity of the local parks where Regina once might have laughed with her friends. The mystery has become a part of the local lore, a story that serves as a reminder of the fragility of safety and the enduring power of a life lost too soon. The streets of Queens are filled with millions of stories, some loud and triumphant, others soft and tragic. Regina's story is one of the quietest, a melody that never reached its final note, leaving us only with the resonance of what might have been. It is a legacy of remembrance in a city that often forgets. The light is fading now, and the vibrant colors of the day are softening into shades of indigo and slate. The hustle of the city is slowing to a gentle pulse, a rhythmic thrum that mirrors the steady beat of a heart at rest. We have walked the path of this investigation, through the shadows and the light, and now we reach the end of the road. The brick houses of Middle Village stand silent under the watch of the stars, their secrets tucked away behind locked doors and sleeping eyes. There is peace in the stillness, a sense of closure that comes not from answers, but from the act of holding a memory close. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.